And just another quick reminder that if you're not speaking, to keep yourself muted. That'll be very, very helpful. And next on the agenda are a couple of presentations to discuss the data aspect of the crisis and looking at and we were actually really alluding to some of this in the prior session. So let's get started with this session. And Regina, are you out there and ready to present?
So another person from Populus will be presenting.
Yeah, hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Rodney Stiles, the head of policy at Populus. So Regina actually had a little bit of a family emergency. Everything's okay, but she's unable to make it today. But she obviously, sends her regrets, but also me in her place to share some of the things that we've been thinking about and observing over the last couple of months.
Thank you so much for stepping in.
Of course, and it's so great to see many familiar faces and names, so I'm actually really happy to have stepped in on Regina's behalf today.
Awesome.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can everyone see that?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. Oh, sorry. Still see it?
Looks great. Thank
Fantastic.
you.
Of course. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about some of the data that we're seeing post-COVID, especially around micromobility services, bikes and scooters, but also a lot of the thought that we've been doing, and this gets to the presentation from Move It, and speaking of just like connected themes of the other sort of data that goes out from cities to mobility operators, right? How do we communicate digitally when it's imperative that we do that, because many of our old, medium, digital or non-digital media just don't work, right? We've got to find new ways to get messages out there quickly and give people the most up-to-date information. So in case anyone doesn't know who we are, Populus is about 2.5-year-old company focusing on helping cities manage the right-of-way and the mobility providers that use that right-of-way. And the way that we do that is through ingesting data from mobility providers like bikes and scooters, but also, as I'll talk a little bit more about, sketching out digital policies so that cities can communicate to those operators and to the general public, what the rules of the road are. When we started this year, we had been so heavily focused on micromobility the last 2 years, as that has been the big issue for 2 years. But this year really wanted to focus back on mobility more broadly, and very specifically on the curb. I think, as Regina and I like to say, it's the 3rd annual year of the curb, because we keep talking about how important it is to better manage digitally that asset for cities, especially as I think today, as sort of came up in the last conversation, I think with things like revenue shortfalls and the curb being a place where cities have traditionally had authority to exercise and price, it's going to be even more important. But I think, starting the year with that thought of the curb, COVID comes, and I think it's a completely different situation. So, instead of what you see on the left, our transit services, the increase of curb usage and demand for the curb, with more deliveries, with ride-hailing services, with floating car share, that sort of shifted, and there's more of a focus on micromobility, both docked and undocked systems. Delivery has become even more important as people are staying home and having more goods delivered to them. And, services like ride-hailing services aren't being used as much, although that is increasing again now. But instead, we're seeing, some of the other services that some companies like Uber provide. On-demand delivery has also grown. What's interesting when you look at a lot of dock bike share systems, there's actually been increases in the usage of that system. So I actually live in New York, I'm in Queens, and have certainly seen a very big increase in the use of city bikes, just seeing more of them out there as people are looking for alternative options to riding the subway or bus. I think beginning in March and April, we were seeing that micromobility services were definitely seen as essential, and many cities like San Francisco were coming out and stating that directly, that they deemed those services essential and wanted to, have those services out there and available for the riding public to take. But what we saw, at least in the early days, was, some of the operators, whether because it was logistically too difficult to continue to manage their systems, to rebalance and clean, decided to actually pull those systems from many cities. But now we are seeing them return. And I think in the meantime, what we also saw was a little bit of consolidation in the market, right? Uber and Lyft, or Uber and Lime consolidating their offerings. Something that I think, probably other folks on this call also thought was going to happen this year regardless, but I think COVID has certainly accelerated some of that consolidation within the market. But as we sort of get these services back online, and what we do for a lot of cities is really ingest this data and make sense of it so that they can understand the trends within their own city in terms of how many trips and how long are those trips, and what routes are people taking. We're definitely seeing that people are returning to those services as they are being put back on the streets. And I think one of the really interesting takeaways that we've seen, and I think every scooter operator has posted on their own blog as well, is just the change of trip distances has been a really interesting change. And I think this suggests that instead of maybe linking folks to that express bus or that subway station, that scooters are indeed actually just replacing the entire trip from A to B. So here's just a little snippet of data that we pulled for several cities that Spin operates in. So we're partner Spin and help them deliver data to cities that they operate in, but you can see here across many large metros in the US, looking from May 2019 to the following year, this year in May, just seeing the share of trips that are above 2 kilometers in distance, that across all of them, that share has risen with the exception of Washington, DC. Something else that cities are thinking about is, how can they very quickly, and I think this has been the interesting trend this year, very quickly make changes to the public right-of-way to both accommodate physical distancing as people are getting outside and exercising or dining, but also make space for essential workers to get to work, through alternative modes, biking, scooting, walking. And this isn't a complete snapshot, but cities across the US and also across the world have adopted a number of different strategies, from closing streets, or I think what we see most commonly is reducing streets to be restricted to through traffic, so allowing local access only, putting up some kind of physical barrier. Sometimes it's just a very simple barricade. Sometimes it has become more elaborate, more of an opportunity for folks in the community to come and decorate and put their stamp on it. But closing those streets so that people can use them and they're no longer just there to move cars. I think another big trend that we saw, especially early on, where restaurants were restricted to delivery and pickup only, was cities soliciting from businesses where they should designate curbside loading zones for people to quickly get in and get out and pick up the things that they were ordering. I think this expanded even more as several states and municipalities expanded that category of pickup from not just restaurants to other retail establishments. And then a handful of cities have also taken this opportunity to expand bike lanes, whether that's in the case of Oakland, where they started with their existing bike master plan and really just, accelerated those plans in this current moment, or identifying new corridors where people are traveling to temporarily put up pop-up bike lanes. So as cities are reclaiming streets for people, just a few highlights here, right? So Bogota really expanded their Ciclovia network and put in a ton of new bike lanes. Oakland, as I mentioned, has created a lot of space based off of their existing master plan. Here in New York, after much pressure, political, from advocates, from city council, from a failed start at trying to close some space, we're finally seeing a lot of new designated open space. Some of that is very successful. Some I will mention personally I have experienced is not as successful. But there is a lot more space that's out there and dedicated for people. And Portland, Paris, San Francisco, Lima, they all have similar slow streets plans that they've implemented. And in addition, as I mentioned, making that takeout priority zone and now retail establishment pickup priority zones. But one of the things that we found as we were seeing cities think about creating these new spaces is really, and this is a very reductive form of the planning process, how do you adapt the planning process, which is a typically much longer process, where you think about the when and the where and the who and the planning phase, and then ideally, I hope you go out and work with the community and get citizen engagement and stakeholder engagement to really refine that plan. And ultimately, you've got to communicate that out. How is this road going to shift and change, right? If you're building a new bike lane, how do you communicate and engage with the business organizations along that corridor? And then part of it, how do you evaluate those changes and then kind of start the whole process again, right? Tweak around the edges or tweak in a really big way if something's successful and you want to expand it out even further. So I think what we were thinking about is how are city planners supposed to do all of this when many of them for the very first time are working from home. I used to work for the city government in New York, and I remember actually last year doing an emergency response exercise where we had a hypothetical airborne flu pandemic. I kid you not. And one of the first things we mentioned is how the workforce we're going to have to figure out how to work remotely. And we were told, absolutely not, this is never going to happen. With the way that the union contracts are negotiated, everyone has to come to work every day. We can't let people work from home. Sure enough, some folks I still know in government, 3 weeks in, they are working from home, and accessing your tools remotely and making sure you do the right thing is very different in a remote situation. And I'll also add that the other big change is just the accelerated timeline, right? We're seeing cities make these announcements and within weeks really build out these changes quickly. And I think this really gets to two pieces, the engagement and the communication piece, where it's just not there, where today, if you look at Google Maps, Apple Maps, Waze, there's no easy way to make sure that the changes that are happening to our streets get into those platforms, or even communicated with operators of the space, Uber, Lyft, Via, FedEx, UPS, right? And this is one of the places where we really wanted to step in and help cities, because today it's really reliant, as many things are, on relationships. So having talked to dozens of cities about this particular issue, we found that cities were more successful in getting their road closures into like Google or Apple Maps if one, I think proximity to the Bay Area was very high as a factor, just because those companies are based there and it's a little bit more on the personal workers' radars, but also the size of the city and what personal contact a city, transportation official might have with those contacts to make sure that those changes end up. So it's not an automated system. And I think today when things are changing really rapidly, there's less room for waiting for weeks and weeks for it to be noticed and for it to be updated, especially as folks are still using those spaces. So one of the models that we really had for this was how cities were using our platform to really study and then plan from how bike share and scooter users were making use of the public right of way. So in this particular map, we've got a map of Cleveland, and it shows basically the road segments by which ones are most popularly traveled over by scooter users. And, I think this isn't the place to talk about privacy, but I think one of the really great things about what we do is here we're not actually telling you every user's path from A to B, we're aggregating it across all these segments and really giving what I think cities are pretty interested in, which is where should we focus our infrastructure, right? So you can take something like that and plan out a new bike lane, or similarly in Arlington County, looking at parking events of scooters and bikes. Officials in Arlington were able to see that heat map, find out where people were parking the most, and in these blue dots right here that you see, they've planned out bike and scooter parking corrals. So being able to plan for infrastructure in the place where it's needed. And I think the interesting thing here is the way that this was then digitally communicated. So scoping out that area along the street and sending it back to the Lime app or the Bird app so that the user can see this is the parking area, this is how where I should park my bike or scooter. And so we kind of took that model and thinking about street closures, right? Something that's easy for anybody to use at the city. You don't have to have GIS expertise, especially if maybe you don't have access to your GIS software at home right now because you're working remotely. So to be able to sketch out on a map, say a street that you want to restrict access to, and then set those parameters, right? The dates that it's in effect, the times it's in effect, which road users are affected by that, right? Is it for bikes and scooters and pedestrians only? Is it, as we've seen for many, just for local access? Is it completely restricted from cars? So we've worked with a number of cities to be able to do that and then help them present back out that information. And I think, ultimately the goal is to work with mapping providers, folks like Google and Apple, and really close this gap. And I think, in our conversations with folks like that, I think it's helpful on their end because they're looking for a source they can trust and one that they don't have to waste their own staff resources to vet and validate. So that's one of the things that we've really been focused on, is not just the data in from the mobility operators, but the data also that cities are pushing out so that those that use their public right of way understand what's happening and going on. So I'll leave this up here for a little bit so you can grab my contact information, but thank you so much for having us present. Once again, really, Regina sends her regrets. I'll also put this information in the chat box, but looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Rodney. That was really good and very thought-provoking.